expert speakers. It's my great honor. I'm very happy to introduce a friend here from the house, Alejandro Ribeiro, also from Uruguay. Probably the reason I'm here is because of him. Through several chains of events, a very good friend. I remember when I arrived here back in 2006, stay at his house for a month or so, and then since then, great friend and collaborator. Alejandro, as you know, he got his PhD here from the University of Minnesota back in 2007. Then he's been since then at Penn, where now he's a professor of electrical and systems engineering. His work is in wireless autonomous networks, machine learning on graphs and network data, and distributed collaborative intelligence, a lot of which he's going to be telling us today. His work does, his group does amazing work. I know firsthand, and for that they received numerous awards and papers for his research program as well as his teaching. So it's great to have him here.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you. Well, you know, a lot of the speakers started by describing the relationship to Yorgo's work. I don't need to do that, right? Everything that I do stems from what I did here at those days at SpinCon. So, you know, the approach that I took to this presentation, Yorgo, this is a SpinCon seminar for you. You know, I hope that you will interrupt me less than you did when I was a student. Yeah. I hear those laugh, right? So all of my former lab mates know what I'm talking about. The rest of you don't. But, you know, those interactions are what make us good presenters. So don't get this the wrong way. You know what? I want to talk today about intelligence autonomous networks. So this is the kind of problems that I try to study. Here on the left we have a consensus problem. All of these drones are trying to coordinate their velocities, are trying to, you know, all of them fly at the same speed. So on the right here we have a wireless communications network. The problem here is that we want to allocate resources so that, you know, we satisfy some quality of service requirements. A couple other examples of these intelligence autonomous networks are this one here on the left. That's a multi-vehicle routing problem. There's a bunch of red places that we want to visit with a team of green robots. And, well, you know, we need to find trajectories for these robots to cover this space. On the right, we have mobile infrastructure of demand problem. There's a team of red robots that are executing some task, and we are trying to position these blue robots in the middle so that they support communications for the team of blue robots. In all of these four examples that I showed you, we call these things intelligent because we use artificial intelligence to find policies. And artificial intelligence for me is a synonym of machine learning, and machine learning for me is a synonym of signal processing. I know this can be controversial, but that's the only controversial thing that I'm going to say today. I'm at home after all. These networks are also autonomous because the idea here is that there is no human in the loop, right? So the system itself is making decisions on where the robots should go, what the power allocation should be. Now, I am going to make two contentions here. The first one is that these systems become interesting when they are large scale, right? So I show you examples with a few robots, but, you know, if these systems have hundreds of robots, they become way more interesting. The second example, the second contention that I'm going to make is that these systems have complex requirements, right? So there's multiple things that these systems have to do, or multiple constraints that these systems have to satisfy simultaneously. And, in order to address these two issues, I think that we need to develop new mathematical understanding. I think that sometimes a misconception is that because we are learning solutions, we don't need to analyze them. I don't think that this is true. I think that precisely because we are learning them, we need to analyze them, right? So, you know, if I design the system, I'm making the decisions of what the system should do. If I am learning the policies, well, I'm losing the control that I have, the precise control that I have over the policy. So I need to understand the fundamentals of the policy even better than if I were designing the solution myself. Now, in order to talk scalability, I'm going to tell you about the theories we've been developing on the limit properties of graph neural networks. So before I do that, let me tell you about convolutional neural networks, which are stacks of layers, each of which are compositions of convolutional filters with pointwise nonlinearities. And the reason why I am beginning with CNNs is because we know that CNNs scale. we use them in very large images. Now, however, a CNN is designed to process this kind of information. We want to process, however, this other kind of information. But here is a path to generalization, right? Let us generalize convolutions, and after we generalize convolutions, we go back to this picture and we replace the standard convolutional block by a graph convolutional block, and that's what is called a graph neural net. Now, what do I mean, or what is the reason that CNNs scale? Well, first off, images or discrete time signals, they have well-defined limits. And what we know, that's, by the way, the sampling theorem, is that convolutions running on these discrete objects, they have well-defined limits. And that's the reason why it is possible for us to train convolutional neural networks in images of a small dimensionality, which we can then generalize to images of higher dimensionality. Now, what would be the equivalent in graphs? Well, here I am showing you the conversions of a graph to a graphon, and a graphon is just a limit object of a sequence of graphs, and you can think of a graphon as a graph with an uncountable number of edges. The two things that can be proven here are the following, which is A, that graph convolutions have well-defined limits on graphons. This is important, by the way. So the fact that the graph converges to the graphon, well, that doesn't mean that the graph neural network or the graph convolution will converge to the graphon neural network or graphon convolution, but it does. And from that fact, we can conclude that GNNs transfer, meaning that they can be trained on moderate-sized graphs and executed on larger-scale graphs. Now, the reason why this transference holds is actually not difficult to see. I am showing you here what a graph convolution does. And I know that, there's equations here. I don't really have the time to explain them, but, this is a shift register. I'm just changing the definition of the shift. And the shift here is multiplication by an adjacency matrix of the graph. The graphon convolution is algebraically the same structure, except that now the shift is not a multiplication by an adjacency matrix of the graph, but it is the application of the linear operator associated with the graphon. Now, the fact that these things are algebraically equivalent to the standard shift register tells you, if you remember your basic signal processing, that these things will have spectral representations. And these spectral representations are interesting because they are functions of a single variable or a single scalar, which depends on the coefficients of the filter but does not depend on the graph. The graph, however, hasn't disappeared. The graph is still there in the instantiation of the eigenvalues on which this frequency response is expressed. Again, right, since the graphon is algebraically equivalent, since the graphon convolution is algebraically equivalent to the graph convolution, which is algebraically equivalent to the standard convolution of signals in time, it follows that it has a frequency representation, which again is independent of the graphon, except for the fact that the eigenvalues of the graphon determine the places at which this frequency response is instantiated. If, therefore, the eigenvalues of the graph converge to the eigenvalues of the graphon, which they do, then convergence of graph convolutions to graphon convolutions follows, and, well, that's a theorem that can be proven, and the statement is there for your reference. We can also establish a bound for finite number of nodes in the graph, and that bound is interesting because it uncovers the role that the variability of the frequency response is playing. Let's go back to the plot with the frequency response here. This frequency response has a certain Lipschitz constant, and I know this Lipschitz constant should be finite, right? Otherwise I could have wild oscillations here that would prevent convergence. So it's somewhat clear that the Lipschitz constant of this frequency response plays a role in convergence, and indeed it does. It controls the speed of convergence. Not really the rate, although I typically say the rate. It controls the speed of convergence of the convolution of the graph convolution to the graphon convolution. And that tells you something very interesting, which is that there is a trade-off between the discriminability of the graph convolution and the transferability of the graph convolution, because in order for this thing to be discriminative, you want the Lipschitz constant to be large, but in order to transfer, you want the Lipschitz constant to be small. I didn't tell you anything about graph neural networks yet, but this is a graph neural network. I replaced the convolutions by graph convolutions. This is a graphon neural network. I replaced the convolutions by graphon convolutions. And of course, the pointwise nonlinearity is pointwise, right? It's independent of the graph or independence of the graphon. So the exact same theorems will hold for the conversions of GNNs to graphon neural networks. This works. The experiment here, that's the consensus problem that I showed you earlier on. And what we do here is something like this. We train on a graph with 40 nodes, and then we execute on a graph with 100 nodes, and we see what is the performance loss. And you see here that, if you train with 30 nodes and generalize to 100, you lose a little bit of performance. But you can train with 50 nodes, execute on a network with 100 nodes, and there's no loss of performance whatsoever. And, that's not a one-off. Same thing holds true for recommendation systems. Several other examples of transfer. Now that's the first part of the talk. In the second part of the talk, I want to talk about requirements. In particular, I want to talk about learning under requirements. So let me show you again this mobile infrastructure on demand problem. And there's something here that right, which is that there's not a single thing that I want my agents to do here. I have multiple rate requirements, multiple individual energy requirements. We have aggregate rate requirements. We have collision constraints. I mean, there's several things that I want my system to satisfy. And that makes it antithetical, I think, to require, by the way, what it should be? What? Antithetical.
Yes, that's it.
Oh, no, but it was, anyways, yeah. Sorry. What was I saying? Yes, the fact that we have multiple constraints makes it antithetical to standard learning approaches in which has minimized individual losses. The kind of problem that we actually want to formulate is something like this, right? So we want to formulate the optimization of a loss subject to a number of losses. So we have a constrained learning problem. Now this is a little bit of a problem because, the parameterization here is typically not convex. So I have defined here a non-convex optimization problem, which these things tend to be the least useful objects in the world because, you can write them down, but you can't solve them. Nevertheless, let me write down the Lagrangian. Actually, let me go make two steps in one here. I'm not only writing the Lagrangian, but I am writing the empirical Lagrangian. And what we would really what we would really like is to operate with the Lagrangian because the Lagrangian is a learning problem without constraints, and we know how to solve this. But in order for this to be possible, we would need this quantity here, which is the empirical dual optimum, to be similar to the statistical primal optimum. And that happens to be true. That's the theorem that we proved in this case, which is that the empirical dual optimum and the statistical primal optimum are close. That bound actually is very interesting because it has all the right quantities. In blue is the statistical complexity. In green is the richness of the parameterization, is the near universality of the parameterization. And in red is the one norm of the Lagrange multiplier. By the way, something I learned at the University of Minnesota is that this optimal Lagrange multiplier determines the difficulty of the requirements. The larger lambda star is, the more difficult it is to satisfy constraints. So, this, we knew from the beginning was something that had to appear. Now, moving a little more quickly, there's constraint reinforcement learning as well, so that's another problem that we could, that we would like to investigate. Constraint reinforcement learning, again, is difficult because the value functions are non-convex with respect to the policy. Nevertheless, right, you know the trick. I'm still going to write down the Lagrangian, and I still would like to show, right, that the dual problem is a good proxy for the primal problem, and this happens to be true. In this particular case, I haven't yet introduced the parameterization. The optimal primal and the optimal dual are equivalent, and this holds because of interesting connections between formulations in policy space and occupancy measure spaces. And I am sure that Yorgo is smiling here because, lack of validity gap, that's what I did here, right? So, he can see strong echoes of his own work in these slides that I am covering. And that's the reason why I chose them. If we introduce the parametrization, the same theorem that I showed you would hold for constraint reinforcement learning as well. Now, there's a couple other things that I would like to say. First, that's just an example. So this is the wireless network. We would like to maximize some rates subject to individual quality of service requirements. That's the problem written in reinforcement learning language. And, well, these things work. And what is interesting here is that we have a couple of learn policies. These learn policies, they do better than heuristics, right? So even though we are solving these optimization problems with constraints which we know are non-convex, the fact that quality gap are small imply that you can still obtain performance that is optimal. We don't really know that the performance is optimal, by the way. The optimal is impossible to compute, but the fact that we have performed good heuristics tells you that we are probably indeed close to the optimal solution. Here's another example of the value of utilizing constraints. So this is safety. And I am comparing constraint reinforcement learning with reward shaping. And there's substantial advantages to the use of constraint reinforcement learning, particularly when you want when you want safety at the level of 3 nines or 4 nines. The imposition of constraints is really what allows you to satisfy these high levels of safety. Okay, a couple other things, and these are just headlines. The papers are down there. I don't want you to get the impression that because we have only the problems are easy, the problems are still very difficult because the lack of convexity generates issues of primal recoverability. Okay, that's just a headline. It's for those of you in the know, essentially. A second difficulty or a second challenge here is that specifying constraints is difficult. Because we are going into unknown environments, we are supposed to not know how the data looks like. So that calls for the introduction of problems that allow you to adapt constraints, and we do that through this notion of resilient constraint learning, in which we try to equate the marginal cost and benefits of relaxations, which is, by the way, also information that is contained in optimal dual variables, which allows us to do interesting things in continual learning or active learning. Now, this is all. I talked today about 2 things. One of them is scalability, and I told you 2 things about scalability. The first one is that learn policies parameterized by graph neural networks have well-defined limits, and that fact allows us to train networks at mesoscales and transfer those networks to larger scales. And I also told you about learning with requirements, where I told you essentially 3 things. The first one is that both in supervised and unsupervised learning, you can have small duality gaps, which allows you to solve the problems in the dual domain. And then, even though I didn't discuss it in detail, there's 2 other things that are important to remark. The first one is that we still need to do something fancy in order to actually find solutions. That comes in the form of state augmentation and maximization of Lagrangians. And the relaxation of constraints, I think, is an underappreciated problem in learning with constraints. So, for that, we advocate the use of resilient learning. But, other alternatives are possible here. And, if I have one message for you, it is that, in these problems the use of learning is a necessity. I mean, we cannot ignore the existence of machine learning. It has been very successful. So I personally think that that's a real opportunity there. But sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that that doesn't call for new mathematics, but it actually does call for a lot of new mathematics. Right? So there is a substantial need for understanding the fundamentals of these algorithms. I'm almost in time, but before I finish, I have something to tell Jorgo, so after I take questions, I would like you to stay for 5 minutes if you can, okay? Thank you.
For a couple of questions, if there's any. Please.
For learning with constraints, what kind of constraints can we handle? Apart from the average constraints, can we handle something like chance constraints?
Okay, so there are several questions to this, several answers to this question, Vasilis. What Vasilis is asking me is here, so I formulated this optimization problem in which I am minimizing an expected loss subject to some other losses, expected losses. If you want to have chance constraints, right, I mean, chance constraints are expectations of indicator functions. And I did not require convexity of the losses here, so that can be handled. Another possibility of handling chance constraints is to impose what are point-wise constraints. You impose one constraint per realization. That is also possible. It will, however, require the losses to be convex. And a third possibility is to have conditions on the output itself, right? Conditions on F theta. Those are actually easy to impose because you just can incorporate them into the learning architecture.
Okay, so to follow up a little, so often in problems like this, we care about risk, right? We care more about the variance. Like in a safety or
yes.
Not the average.
Right, yes, of course. That's one of the reasons to care about constraint learning. I mean, I'm writing an expectation, but the variance that we are defining is an expectation. I mean, risk measures are expectations. I could write the covariance value at risk here. I could write quantile constraints. Actually, one of the examples here is safety in reinforcement learning, and the way that safety in reinforcement learning is typically managed is through reward shaping. You try to say, these are the things that I don't want to happen. I'm going to penalize you if you do them. What we do here is no. I mean, this, you don't want this to happen. Then your constraint is that you don't want this to happen. And, not wanting this to happen could be, I don't want the variance of my method to be more than 6.
Constraints and maybe the numbers over time might help us make a decision on a very sensitive matter or sensitive problem.
Yeah, that has to do with the question that Vasilis gave, right? Because I said that there are 3 different types of constraints that you can impose. Average constraints, which is what is written over here. You can impose point-wise constraints, which is like, for every point in time, I don't want this to happen. And then you can have constraints on the outcome, precisely. Those are the ones that I said are easy to impose because you just say, my parametrization is such that this is impossible. Like the output is between 0 and 1, so you just make your output be between 0 and 1.
Okay, but for that,
Perfect. Yes. In that case, what you have in mind are what I am calling point-wise constraints, which is that you want to impose constraints for something to happen at each point in time, and this is what we do in this safety paper.
The question was similar to the previous. I think the constantly learning paradigm showed the same thing I don't see that the problem has to be in finite horizons. Does it learn fast enough, say? Does it do what it needs so it can be done by different time? I think that's also related to the one.
Yes, and that's a great point, because what I'm saying is that this is an artifact of how I wrote the problem to simplify the presentation. I could have added over there a constraint with a finite horizon. I could add there a constraint for an individual point in time, right? So like a reward at time t has to, sorry, not the reward, yeah, there's some reward at time t that you want to be less than 0, right? I mean, you don't want to bump against the wall. So those things you can impose here as other kinds of constraints. Yeah.
So if we have 2 components, then any kind of coding the function and what coding the object.
Yeah. It's a very good question. So like first off, I don't want to have 2 considerations, right? If I have 2 considerations, you don't need a PhD to solve this kind of problem, right? I mean, this can be interesting when you have 55 different considerations. Now, when you have 55 different considerations, the question is, okay, I mean, which of these 55 should be the one in the objective? Right? Okay. That is the question of systems engineering. It's not a question of machine learning, right? And actually, I would like, that's not the question that the engineer should answer. That's the question for the customer. And let me tell you something, right? I mean, there's a lot of people in the tech industry thinking about fairness. I mean, why are engineers working on fairness, right? I don't have a PhD in sociology that allows me to decide what is fair. So the customer is the one that should tell me, this is my definition of a fair system, and I will solve that optimization problem.